Let's take a look back at Phantasm 2, the sequel to 1979's Phantasm, which is probably a logical place to start this look back at. Phantasm is a science fiction horror film directed, written, photographed and edited by Don Coscarelli. A truly independent film shot on a budget of $300,000 using a cast and crew of amateurs and aspiring film professionals, it went on to become a smash box office success, grossing $12 million, and is a cult classic of the horror genre. I remember seeing Phantasm at some point in the past on late night TV, but could only remember the tall man antagonist and the glitter balls of death that drill into people's faces. Beyond that, I had nothing. Having rewatched this, I can comfortably say that the film is about death and mourning, and how a child deals with and processes grief. The iconic antagonist of the tall man, played by Angus Scrimm, is obviously a representation of death himself, with his homeworld briefly seen when Mike, our child protagonist, played by Michael Baldwin, is sucked through the portal into it. It's obviously hell. It's a very, very warm red planet, almost the fire and brimstone of popular imagination, where people are essentially tortured for eternity via being used as slave labour. With Don Coscarelli saying about his inspiration for the film, I had a compunction to try to do something in the horror genre, and I started thinking about how our culture handles death. It's different than in other societies. We have this central figure of a mortician. He dresses in dark clothing, he lurks behind doors, they do procedures on the bodies we don't know about. The whole embalming thing, if you ever do any research on it, is a little bit freaky. It all culminates in this grand funerary service production. It's strange stuff. It just seemed like it would be a great area in which to make a film, with dreams and surrealism being vitally important to portraying this to the audience. Just like Suspiria last week, the film has a dreamlike narrative structure where the disjointed and uneven story works to create the impression of being stuck in a dream, or more, a nightmare. This structure was actually a result of Coscarelli editing the original runtime down, cutting most of the character development and connective scenes after disastrous audience reaction to early screenings of the film. Phantasm is a prime example of horror done well, in my opinion. On the surface, it is a fairly nonsensical series of events played for scares that can be enjoyed purely on that level, but in reality those scares are linked to a real-life psychological fear every human has, that of death, and how it stalks us constantly. Throw in the absolutely iconic antagonist of the tall man, a truly terrifying figure who wins in the end because death can't be defeated anywhere but in dreams, and you have a stone cold classic on your hands, which I highly recommend to you all. Which brings us to the sequel, which I again have seen before on late night TV and only remember little bits, mainly the ending and the flying disco balls of death again. It's yet another movie I've covered in this series that was doomed by studio mandated changes and interference. The first contentious change was to even have a sequel at all, with the first film having what Coscarelli felt was a conclusive ending, and not really knowing how to start a sequel based off of that, it also being almost a decade since the original's release. But with Universal Studios offering a budget of $3 million and him having the idea to just start the movie straight from the ending of the original film and add a road trip element, he decided to go ahead with it. The budget was actually the lowest budget allocated to any film for Universal of the entire decade, but is the highest budget of any Phantasm film. The second and most controversial decision with fans was to recast the main protagonist of Mike, with Michael Baldwin being replaced with James LaGrosse, this being a studio mandate as they refused to work with a non-working actor. This was initially very unpopular with fans of the original, but has over the years become less contentious, with LaGrosse's performance becoming more accepted over the years. I have to say though, having re-watched these two films, I wouldn't have known LaGrosse was a working actor and the original child was an amateur, because his performance is actually a million times better than LaGrosse's. But for me, the biggest and worst change was to the very narrative formula that makes the original film so good, with the studio refusing to allow Coscarelli to have any dream sequences, surrealism or ambiguity at all. In the original, the ending is ambiguous as to whether any of what we had just witnessed was in fact real or a dream. Whether Mike was in fact just dreaming it leaves you thinking about it days later. For the sequel, that very same ending just leaves you thinking, what? Alchemy was a zombie demon this whole time? The sequel is essentially just played like a bog standard 80s action horror film rather than the surrealist meta-narrative on death and mourning of the original, with the subtle hints to our universal fear of death just being replaced by more gore, more action and more firepower. Critics on release weren't kind either, with Variety describing it as an utterly unredeeming full gore sequel. Which is exactly how I feel about Phantasm 2. Everything is bigger and bolder and more gory, but nothing is as good as the original. When you've seen one flying disco ball of death drill a man's face, you don't need to see 3 do it in one movie. It loses its shock value somewhat. Or for that matter, have a golden one. Because of course gold is better than silver. Ugh, give me a break, Hollywood. It's exactly the kind of thing that annoys me the most about sequels. It's kind of the same thing, you know, but just a bit bigger, and all the charm, subtlety and appeal of the original has been removed in the process somehow. Phantasm 2 isn't a terrible, unwatchable movie. It falls somewhere between a cross of Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2 and the original Phantasm. And that of course isn't a totally bad thing, as both of those movies are great. It's just not as good as either. It has some decent gore and action, and chainsaw duels are always welcome in my book. I can't ever remember seeing the 3 sequels that followed, but if Rotten Tomatoes is to be believed, it looks as if they get progressively worse. So that's Phantasm 2, yet another movie that studio interference changed for the worse, taking the subtle psychological horror of the original and turning it into a typical bombastic 80s sequel. If you enjoyed this, then comment, like and subscribe. Due to work and life commitments, I'm not sure if Event Horizon will be out next week or in 2 weeks, maybe even 3 weeks, but it is happening.